finally getting around to filling in a little bit of my video backlog and showing some close-ups of swords I haven't shown yet. So if you follow the channel, you'll probably have seen this sword already, either in the background of a few videos, or in the video where I compared different kinds of walloon swords. And this one, if you remember, is the shortest out of them, so the scaled down version, let's say. So today, while I may give a few general notes on walloon-hilted swords, the video is not going to be about walloons in general, but it's going to be looking specifically at this one. So first of all, when I say small and tiny, I actually mean it. This sword comes in at, I think, 78-ish centimeters, a little bit less than 78 centimeters. So this is storta area in terms of length, not shape of the blade, of course, but this is really a tiny, tiny sword. Why this is, considering that walloon-hilted swords are very often broad, big, heavy kind of swords, I don't know. And while I have seen walloon-hilted swords that are short because the blade has been shortened, either because of a breakage or because of preference of the owner, I would guess, this isn't really that. So this sword, actually, if you look at the hilt is equally scaled down together with the blade. So a normal walloon-hilted sword will have a hilt that is considerably wider than this. It's more comfortable and fits a gloved hand, for example. Well, maybe not a gauntlet, but that kind of thick leather glove, buff leather, which you would see in commonly in 17th century uniforms. This sword, as you can probably see, does not fit that. My hand fits very snugly in the hilt. It's not uncomfortable. It's actually very comfortable. This is one of those cases where you feel the semi-basket here really wrapping around your hand. But for instance, my knuckle rubs against this decorative section here on the guard. Not always, not in any case, but a bigger hand might have a problem there. And you also see the remaining shell here is kind of built rounded, and I think that is to actually fit the finger snugly, because if it were flat, as is the case, or flatter, as is the case on some walloon-hilted swords, it would probably be interfering with, well, your index knuckle and the index finger itself. So it's a small sword. Why it is the case, again, I don't know. My main hypothesis here is that this was built for use on a ship, perhaps. So 17th century, what we're talking about here is a time of, obviously, a lot of naval exploration on the part of European superpowers or naval powers, like the Dutch, the English, and more. So these swords, as a very common model of sword used at the time, were also used on ships. So it stands to reason that perhaps someone had one made in a more manageable size that could be used, for example, below deck if needed, or even on deck, but in a very kind of close quarter situation. Whereas most of the walloon swords actually almost go into like broadsword kind of size, and depending on, well, the size of the shape of the blade and everything, could even be cavalry swords. This one is most definitely not that. So this is all I can say about it. It's definitely part of an old collection because it has some old varnish over the whole assembly here. The grip is not, you'll see it's really, really thin. So the grip is really narrow. Yes, you can see it there. This is, I mean, by design, because the edges here where it connects to the pommel and to the hilt are still really thin, but it's probably missing its original leather or wire wrapping. What we have here is some old tape, basically masking tape or something like that, or gauze tape. And this one has also been painted black and varnished. I will probably be removing this in a upcoming video because well, the wooden grip here is a little loose, so I want to check if it's perhaps broken or not. And I'm actually hoping that the wood in this case is broken, because that would give us access to the tang, and who knows, there might be inscriptions or symbols on the tang. Because another thing this sword doesn't have is any kind of marking. So, well, none that I can see at least. So no maker's marks, no kind of inscription, no decoration or anything of the sort. So, well, that's it for the introduction, and let's get looking at the sword in detail. Okay, so first off, don't let yourself be fooled when I talk about a scaled down sword, because while the size may be reduced compared to what most of the original walloons are, it is definitely not a light, I mean, it is light and nimble, but it is a solid blade that could deliver some punch and damage for sure. So we'll start with the blade, which is quite interesting, although rather simple, and then we'll move on to the hilt, which has a few little quirks that I think you may enjoy. So first of all, this blade has a rather typical 17th century kind of profile to it, if you see it here. It's basically a pointy triangle. Well, it has four sides technically because of this central ridge, but it has kind of a triangular shape up this way. And it starts rather broad at the bottom. So here we have around 3 centimeters, I would say, and then tapers pretty consistently and symmetrically up the blade up to the tip, which is a spear tip. The tip, you will see, is in fairly good shape. It has a slight little damage right at the extreme of the tip, but it's nothing that I would say is damaging to the integrity of the sword. Apart from its symmetrical shape, I think what is unique or interesting well, maybe not unique, but what is very interesting about this sword, specifically, if you think of many walloons, they have a fuller kind of running in this area here, and then the blade is often lenticular in section. This is not the case here. Here we have a rather pronounced ridge, so in fact you'll see if I show it, if I show the sword here by the edge. I'm not sure how that translates on camera, but the edges of the ridge here protrude quite a bit. So it's a very thick median ridge here, and it runs all the way up to the tip. You'll see it, I'm not exaggerating, it goes right up to the tip here. This makes for a very solid blade, which does not have a lot of flex to it. So you'll see even at the tip area, here at the débole, it's not really a débole at all, in the sense that, yeah, I'm exerting some pressure, not too much of course, but it does not really budge. It's double-edged, and the edges are still somewhat sharp, both of them, and both of them are sharp up to, well, not right up to the ricasso, but let's say just a few centimeters down. Like here, you can start feeling already the sword was sharpened up to about here. So there's no ricasso in terms of like a shoulder or anything here. The blade just goes straight right into the tang with the configuration it has at the start, although there is a little flattening of the ridge. So this is its designed end, let's say. So you'll see here, perhaps, I'm not sure if it comes through on camera, but you kind of see a little bit of a triangular flattening here. As I mentioned, the blade is fairly sharp, enough that I don't have to worry really about running my hand on it, but if I were to get struck by this, it would probably cut. I would say the blade is in overall rather good condition. You see some staining and patination, but none of it is serious pitting or any damage. If you run your hand on it, you'll feel a little bit of pitting in some sections like here, but overall it's really smooth and feels way smoother than perhaps it looks on camera. Same thing goes for the edge. There are no notches. There's some minor, if you run your hand on this section, which is the kind of the percussion area of the blade, you will feel some small notches. It almost feels like any notch was eventually sharpened over, because you can kind of feel some little bumps, but they're not harsh or sharp, let's say. But there's no visible notch or damage here. So this is what I'm talking about, you see? You can see them on this side. These are these little kind of notches, which maybe point to it having been used at some point. moving on to the hilt. I think the hilt is extremely interesting because it has some very unique characteristics that are not typically found on walloon-hilted swords. But first, let's take a look at what does make it a walloon-hilted sword. And one of the most typical of these characteristics is this kind of frame with a double valve, you could say. This frame has a little groove on the inside, which is made to hold the edge of these plates, which are oftentimes pierced, as you will see in the example of the remaining plate on this sword. Unfortunately, one of the plates has been lost over time, but this offers us an opportunity to take a closer up look at that groove I was mentioning. So these plates are, I'm not going to say they're super delicate. This one feels pretty solid, actually. But you'll also see that their width is nothing that will save your hand from a thrust, especially not from a rigid blade like this, for example. Another element that is rather typical of these swords is the thumb ring. You'll see it basically connects to the outermost edge of the internal ring here, and then it connects to this section of the hilt. It's rather comfortable and spacious. So this you'll find on the vast majority, I would say, of walloon-hilted swords. Some don't have a ring, but most do. And one other iconic characteristic of walloon-hilted swords is this kind of minimalistic basket, semi-basket in a sense. So we have a fairly standard knuckle guard here, which, well, protects your fingers, of course. And then we have 90 degrees kind of away from it. We have a separate loop that comes down on the side, protecting the outside of the hand. Now, in many cases, many walloon swords will also have a second bar, like you see here. However, in most cases, at least in most cases I have seen, and here we can start seeing perhaps the differences, this bar will depart from the side bar here and then come down to connect to the knuckle guard. So it's basically almost mirrored, opposite to what you see here. However, this is a fairly typical walloon-hilted sword. And another characteristic, which is not uncommon, are these decorative elements. I'm not sure what I would call them actually, but you have these enlargements. They can be more or less pronounced. These you see here are actually quite big compared to what you see on some other walloon-hilted swords, but they are not uncommon or unseen. One thing I'm also wondering now is if this added metal perhaps had a function of increasing the weight on the hilt, so as to make it more hilt heavy. This sword feels pretty well balanced, but given the beefiness of the blade, it might have been needed to add metal wherever possible just to kind of balance it better. So actually, since we're talking about balance, I'll show you quickly where its balance point is, more or less. They're kind of, I think, somewhere here. It's not scientific, sorry, but yeah, somewhere there. So yeah, so rather hilt heavy, I would say. Another characteristic which is fairly common is a rounded pommel, although this one is way more flat than what you see in most walloon-hilted swords. A lot of walloons will have more of a olive-shaped or egg-shaped kind of pommel. And the other typical characteristic is that both branches kind of converge onto the pommel and connect into it. So now that we've seen the characteristics that make this sword a walloon hilt, I want to focus a moment on what perhaps brings it away from this classification. So if you haven't seen the previous video where I talked about it already, you might have something that's kind of bugging you a little looking at this. It might feel like a walloon, but there might be something that you can't really pinpoint, and yeah, that's bothering you. I definitely had this feeling for quite some time, until I figured out exactly what it was. And it's the fact that most walloon hilts have one quillin, and it's slightly upturned. Imagine what you would see on a 19th century briquette, kind of. This one instead has two straight quillins, which effectively make it a traditional crossguard, almost like you would see on a medieval sword, in a sense. So it's almost as if this was a traditional crossguard sword over which someone designed the elements that are typical of a walloon-hilted sword. This is most definitely unusual. Unusual, but not unheard of. In the video I was talking about, the previous video, I added some pictures of similar swords I found online. What's also interesting here is, and this I think shows that the sword was all designed coherently, let's say, and is not necessarily like a composite, is the fact that the quillins, you'll see, are in the same style as these enlargements on the bars. So all of these elements are designed kind of consistently. Another thing I wanted to mention, we talked about this bar and how on most walloon-hilted swords it would start here and kind of converge onto the knuckle bow. But another thing that is unusual is this loop, this decorative loop it has at the end. Most of these will actually simply converge flat, like suddenly be add-on to basically the knuckle bow here. This doesn't happen in this case, and this makes it definitely an unusual characteristic. Last thing is the pommel. We already saw that the shape is not necessarily the most typical of pommels for walloon-hilted swords. But what's also extremely interesting from my point of view on this one is that it doesn't have screws. Most walloon-hilted swords are fixed by a screw. This attachment method was very successful. You also see it used on like 18th century military small swords, for instance, or even not necessarily small swords. The Albertina, the Italian Albertina is a good example of that, or the German haudegen, for instance. What has been done here instead, which is something I haven't seen very often, if ever, to be honest, at least on this kind of sword, is to bypass the need for a screw by cutting notches into the pommel and then basically hammering or forcing the ends of these bars into the groove, and then they kind of seat there. You'll see there's a little bit of movement. I think we just saw it. So it's not fixed as well perhaps as a screw would be, but I can tell you it's rather solid. The sword feels, for its age, it feels very, very solid. So there we go. This is my very tiny, downscaled, but also extremely interesting walloon-hilted sword, at least I think. If you have examples, or if you've seen any, or if you happen to see them and this video is still in your head, please take pictures and send them over, because I'd like to understand, to learn more about this kind of crossguard applied to a walloon hilt. Examples do exist, but they're very scarce, so the more I can learn about them, the better it would be. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon on the next one, and thank you for watching.